Thank you. And it's 5 p.m., so I try to be as brief as possible.
It's 5:10.
5:10, 5:10. And partly because it is 5:10, of course, partly because a lot of people speaking before me steal some of my arguments. For the junior scholars, it is a good thing and bad thing. Good thing, a bad thing because you have less to say, but bad thing because, kind of good thing because you feel kind of reassured that your arguments and research actually make sense at this point, right? So I will try to be brief, and I will try to follow actually what the Gardner and Professor Shi talked about ethnic minority policies and in relation to, of course, war on terror. So my argument, basic argument, depends on a political science theory called diversionary theory of war. Diversionary theory of war is one of the most controversial and convoluted theories of political science, right? A lot of people even do not believe that that theory actually exists. But we have movies on it, we have, like a lot of arguments, and we have, in the United States, we have some presidents who were accused of using it too much. The theory basically states that whenever a leader is having some domestic problems, conflicts, low approval ratings, the first thing that president will do is basically try to divert the attention of the public by waging war. Right? You may remember Wag the Dog, you may remember several arguments about this. So this is one of the convoluted theories of political science because it was never proved, but it was mostly speculative. In each and every foreign intervention that the United States has been doing since probably the emergence of theory, there's constant emphasis that it was a diversionary war. It was attempted basically to boost the approval ratings of the president. So more recently, political scientists come out, Tira and Jasinski, and said, well, this theory is not only a theory of external aggression or externalization. This theory can also be used in internalization, which means that states sometimes do not need to find an external foe in order to divert the attention of the domestic public, but they try to find an internal other. And there are several reasons that you find an internal other, because external conflicts are sometimes difficult to control, they are costly and risky, and when you find an external foe, an internal foe, an internal other, this basically makes a conflict that will divert the attention of the public, that will boost your approval ratings, but the conflict itself becomes less risky and more controllable. So according to them, this form of scapegoating is not rare in multi-ethnic societies. For many states, the presence of an ethnic other makes it a real possibility for leaders to target these minority groups as being responsible for a country's domestic ills. They argue that the ethnic minorities outside the in-group constituency may play the role of enemy outsiders quite effectively, and thus attempting a diversion through attacking a domestic target may give you the opportunity to exploit the society's fragmentation in favor of the leader. So the question here is, when do leaders prefer to use internal other instead of an external other? And how this transformation takes place? And my argument here is, especially until 2001, 2002, China was preferring to use an external other. Usually it was the United States or basically the state of Japan as external other. And we see that starting from 2001, the external other, the use of external other declined, and the use of internal other as Uyghurs and war on terrorism increased. Nationalism has been one of the most important topics for scholars who are dealing with politics and society in China over 20 years. Although for some scholars the nationalism in China can be dated to 1949, the latest revival of nationalism was launched in the early 1990s, and Chinese nationalism has been constantly referred to in relation to Chinese foreign policy during those years, particularly in terms of its relation with the United States and Japan. This recent revival in Chinese nationalism dates to the aftermath of the Tiananmen incident and, of course, the fall of Soviet Union. And in these years, we see that in China there is a very programmatic boost in patriotic education and nationalism itself. The government started to promote nationalism and patriotism in these years, partly, according to some scholars, in order to fill the ideological void in the country, partly to solve the legitimacy problems that it encountered as a result of the transformation of former communist countries, and of course to train more patriotic and loyal citizens. The campaign was endorsed by all state agencies and state-controlled enterprises in China, including the government-controlled media. In this top-down nationalism, Western powers and Japanese governments were blamed for Chinese domestic problems, and historical agonies caused by Western imperialism and Japanese expansionism were reaffirmed and reproduced. The message in the patriotic campaigns of the Chinese government in these years fit nicely into the diversionary hypothesis. A government troubled by domestic legitimacy problems and social instability basically aims to rally its people around its flag by scapegoating these external actors. In addition, the territorial disputes with Japan and Western sensitivity to human rights conditions in China were especially presented as evidence of evil Western intentions to its territorial unity. Chinese government's patriotic education process was quite successful in terms of mobilizing society and deflecting its attention. In the late 1990s, the initial outcomes of this campaign become visible in Chinese foreign relations. The criticism from international community for the human rights, even Beijing's failure to win the bid for hosting the 2000 Olympics.
Sir, can you slow down, please? You read very, very fast. Nobody can repeat.
I was trying to be fast.
No, nobody can talk as fast as you do. Even I can. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I need to be able to. Yeah. The criticism from international community of the Tiananmen Square incidents and even the Beijing's failure to win the bid for hosting 2000 Olympics were interpreted as foreign conspiracies in these years. This new form of patriotism in China had preemptive elements to confront the criticism domestically. As Zhao stated, even though corruption and social as well as economic problems have undermined the CCP's legitimacy to an extent, many people in these years side with the government when foreigners criticize it, and believing that no matter how corrupt the government is, foreigners have no right to make unwarranted remarks about China and its people. In the 1990s, late 1990s actually, the most obvious example of this was in several conflicts. The accidental bombing of Belgrade Embassy of China by NATO forces, and the dispute between China and Japan in these years over the Senkaku Islands, we see this first signs of this rise of nationalism, which government basically used very efficiently. But the government's honeymoon with nationalism in the mid-1990s came to an end in later years of the decade. There were several problems in this nationalism. The first one was the problem about nationalism, the emergence of an independent group of nationalist scholars and politicians in China. As you may remember, the China Can't Say No book and other books of the Chinese nationalists started to basically challenge even the state-sponsored nationalism. The second thing was China was trying in these years to basically give an image of peaceful rise of China. And assertiveness of the new nationalist discourse and movement basically challenged this assumption and creating a more aggressive image for Chinese nationalists. On the other hand, and most importantly, China was becoming an economic giant. And economic relations of China with Japan and United States may be disrupted with this increasing anti-American and anti-Chinese, anti-Japanese nationalism in China. So while China was experiencing the double-edged sword of this rising nationalism, September 11 happened. And immediately after September 11, China basically bandwagon with the Western countries and stated that China was also being a victim of the terrorism and international terrorist groups, and started its own discourse on war on terror. War on terror basically helped China in these years, and as many other authoritarian governments, to be able to crack down its dissent, regardless of its nature, regardless of violent and non-violent, and created a favorable atmosphere for China basically to grip its control of. But more importantly, later China discovered that the war on terror could also serve some other purposes. One thing was, especially starting in mid-2000s, China basically discovered that war on terror could be also a very diversionary tactic and strategy for the Chinese government itself, and started to basically reflect its in the quote, anti-nationalism from Japan and United States to an internal foe, and it was basically Uyghurs. In this process itself, actually, China, with the help of its state-controlled media, the war on terror had acquired an ethnic characteristics. Most of the documentaries and propaganda materials pointed to Uyghurs as terrorists or collaborators. As a result of this, in Hillier's terminology, Uyghur society became a suspect community, which was perceived as a source of trouble by the state and a potential instigator of violence via state-controlled media. Like other suspect communities, Uyghurs were singled out as being uniquely problematic by the state itself. Furthermore, this image was later institutionalized with terrorism-related legislation, which besides suppressing all forms of Uyghur descent, was also intended to repress the cultural, linguistic, religious differences of Uyghurs. With this mechanism and strategy, Uyghurs were depicted as the internal other, in order to unify the people of China, rally them against the designated scapegoat. In fact, the new suspect community played a key role in defining and unifying the imagined community itself. Creating in-group and out-group dichotomy, especially with Uyghurs, had been a well-known strategy of Chinese governments throughout decades. They were different in terms of culture, language, religion than the majority of the country. Moreover, their Islamic identity could be instrumentalized in the war against Islamic extremism and terror in these years. Throughout history, we see that different Chinese states and empires use this ethnic group to create an in-group, out-group dichotomy. Uyghurs have historically been the most significant. Before the Communist Revolution of 1949, Uyghurs living in the borderlands of China were labeled as primitive and barbarian by the modern Chinese, whereas after the revolution, the Chinese government depicted most of the Uyghur Muslims as counter-revolutionaries and feudal elements because of their national aspiration and religious beliefs. With the end of the Cold War, the emergence of ethnic conflicts in different parts of the world and global rise of political Islam, Uyghur dissident groups in China were labeled as separatist and Islamic fundamentalist. And finally, with the September 11 attacks and the war on terror, Uyghur dissenting groups once again were on the agenda as internal others for being religious fundamentalists, and this time as terrorists. However, the difference between these historical otherness and the current one was more instrumental than helping the consolidation of the Chinese consolidations of the identity itself. We see different examples of this. One of the few examples that I can state in the next 3 minutes is a couple documentaries. On the Spot report, The Crimes of Eastern Turkestani Terrorist Forces. It was a documentary basically prepared by the propaganda department with the National Security Bureau in order to give the examples of Uyghur terrorism throughout the last 2 decades. The second one was a movie series, again basically produced by the government, state-sponsored media. The name of the series is Tanrıtar Ciddi Hareketler. both of the actually documentary and the movie series showed and kind of internalization of this otherness very effectively, and basically arguing that there are good Uyghurs, there are bad Uyghurs, but the good Uyghurs are more like Chinese, kind of, like Chinese portrayed Han Chinese. They like fun, they can dance, they can sing and other things. But the bad Uyghurs are the Uyghurs who are basically having some political ideas and dissenting to the policies of the government. For many people, it must be admitted that the three evil forces which was offered by the mass media propaganda by the PRC government to keep was successful actually to keep ethnic demands on the defensive, dismiss foreign scrutiny, encouragement or support for the causes of Chinese minorities, and perhaps most importantly, sustain the unity of China's dominant Han Chinese ethnicity. The last aspect is shaping up to be of increasing salience to Chinese leadership in the face of the end-of-state socialist ideology and the homogenizing materialistic and individualistic effects of globalization. To prevent the emergence of centrifugal southern provincial or coastal nationalists that would challenge or at least weaken the present hegemonic state constructed around the ruling CCP patriotic state nationalism. Later, we actually see the kind of more ceremonial part of this after several operations. One of the anti-terror operations in China that took place in January 2007 in Pamir Mountains. Especially after this operation, you see that there is a huge kind of praising of the soldiers who attended this operation. There is all Chinese flags everywhere, kind of trying to show that it was a major operation. And there was one actually soldier who died, and there was mass memorial for this soldier, and it basically reminds everyone that in 1990s when in couple incidents, one in EP-3 plane crash and one the killing kind of suicide of David Wang in Senkaku Island, or we can call it DIU Island so that it can be neutral. In several instances, we see that this kind of mass memorials and kind of praising the killing of these, death of these soldiers took place. And we see in both instances that the people rallied around the flag and people didn't question the nature of the operation. People even didn't look for the evidence for the operation or who were the terrorists itself but supported. Later, the most significant outcomes, I'm completing, most significant outcomes was probably the communal violence that emerged in the region after the consolidation of this other Uyghur identity. And in several instances, both Gardner and Dr. Shi expressed several examples of how the ethnic discrimination become in a more communal level. Finally, to conclude, in the movie Wag the Dog, right, going back to the movie that we started, director Barry Levinson basically gave a fictional White House scandal in which the president has a sexual scandal just before the elections, and in order to win the elections, President waged war against Albania, and the reason that he picked Albania is nobody in the United States knows about Albania, right? So in a democratic country, there are these theories that emerge and showing that sometimes you can use foreign policy in order to consolidate your position in domestic politics. And when it becomes in authoritarian countries, it becomes more like George Orwell's 1984. And it becomes more destructive, not only for the political system itself, but also for the intercommunal relations and inter-ethnic, let's say, homogeneity. Thank you very much.